Alex Warren strode through the polished corridors of his clinic, the comforting hum of subdued conversations and the occasional clink of a coffee cup setting a serene backdrop. The walls, painted in muted blues and greens, were designed to calm the most agitated minds. Each room, an oasis of tranquility, was equipped with plush chairs and soft lighting, curated to make his patients feel as safe as possible. It was a sanctuary from the chaos of the outside world, a place where fears could be dissected and tamed. But today the sanctuary felt slightly off. Drew Warren couldn't put his finger on it, but there was something unsettling about the air. Perhaps it was the whisper of the air conditioning, a fraction louder than usual, or the way the shadows seemed to linger a moment too long in the corners of the rooms. As he entered his office, he found his new patient already waiting. Sarah Davidson, a woman in her mid-30s, sat perched on the edge of the leather chair, her fingers drumming an anxious rhythm on her knee. Her eyes, wide and haunted, darted around the room, never settling on one spot for long. "Good morning, Sarah," Drew Warren greeted, offering a reassuring smile as he took his seat. "How are you feeling today?" Sarah's gaze finally met his, and she shuddered slightly before speaking. "Drew Warren, I know it sounds crazy, but I've been seeing them everywhere." "Seeing what?" he asked, keeping his tone even and calm. "Spiders," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I dream about them, and then I see them when I wake up. Big, small, crawling on the walls, on my skin. I can't escape them." Drew Warren nodded, making a note on his tablet. "Arachnophobia. It's one of the most common phobias. We can work through this together, Sarah." As he spoke, a faint scratching noise caught his attention. It was so soft that he almost dismissed it, but it persisted, a barely there whisper against the backdrop of their conversation. He glanced around but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The unsettling sensation from earlier returned, stronger now, tingling at the base of his spine. "Drew Warren," Sarah's voice pulled him back. "Are you all right?" He smiled, though it felt forced. "Yes, just a bit distracted." "Now, tell me more about these dreams." Sarah recounted her nightmares in detail, her voice trembling. As she spoke, the room seemed to close in on them, the shadows growing darker, the faint hum of the air conditioning transforming into an eerie, almost whisper-like noise. Drew Warren could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end, an inexplicable sense of unease settling over him. He shook it off, focusing on his patient. "We'll start with some relaxation exercises and gradual exposure therapy. It's important to confront these fears in a controlled environment." She nodded, though her eyes betrayed her doubt. "I just want them to stop." "They will, Sarah. It takes time, but we'll get there." After Sarah left, Drew Warren sat in his office, the unsettling feeling refusing to dissipate. He glanced around, the shadows seemed thicker, more pronounced. He dismissed it as a trick of the light, but a nagging voice at the back of his mind wouldn't let go. It was as if the clinic, his sanctuary, was whispering to him, hinting at something just out of reach. Shaking off the eerie sensation, he prepared for his next patient. But the unease lingered, a faint, unsettling whisper in the back of his mind, refusing to be ignored. The next few days passed in a blur of sessions and notes, but the unsettling atmosphere in the clinic persisted. Drew Warren couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The lights flickered more often than they should, and the faint, inexplicable noises continued to disrupt the once tranquil space. It was as if an unseen presence had taken residence, slowly making its way into the hearts and minds of those within. It was during a session with another patient, Michael, who had a debilitating fear of open water, that the chill in the air became tangible. Michael's phobia was severe. He couldn't even look at a glass of water without feeling a wave of panic. As Drew Warren guided him through a visualization exercise, encouraging him to picture a calm, serene lake, he felt an odd sensation. The room's temperature seemed to drop, and a damp, musty smell permeated the air. Warren glanced around, half expecting to see water seeping through the walls. He shook his head, trying to focus. Michael needed his full attention. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of the lake, Warren instructed, his voice steady despite the growing unease. The water is calm, reflecting the sky above. You're safe here, just observing. Michael's breathing grew shallow, his eyes wide with terror. I can't, he whispered, his voice trembling. It's too real. Suddenly, Warren felt a cold, clammy sensation on his skin. He looked down to see his hands dripping with water. His breath hitched as the room seemed to tilt, a powerful wave of vertigo crashing over him. He was no longer in his office but submerged in water, the pressure building in his chest, his lungs screaming for air. Panic surged through him, primal and overwhelming. He clawed at his collar, gasping for breath, but the water was relentless, cold and suffocating. Just as he thought he would drown, the vision shattered, and he was back in his office, soaked with sweat and gasping for air. Michael stared at him, wide-eyed and terrified. Warren, are you okay? Michael's voice was distant, muffled, as if coming through a thick fog. Warren nodded, forcing a smile. I'm fine, Michael. Just a momentary lapse. Let's continue. But inside, he was reeling. This was more than a lapse. It was as if his deepest fear had clawed its way into reality. He couldn't deny the chilling realization that something malevolent was at play, something that thrived on fear. The rest of the session passed in a blur, and as Michael left, Warren sat in his chair, his mind racing. The flickering lights, the eerie noises, the sudden drop in temperature, it all pointed to an ominous presence. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the edge of perception. That night, as he prepared to leave the clinic, he noticed water leaking from the walls in the hallway. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but there. A slow, steady drip that echoed through the empty corridors. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched the damp wall. The water was cold, sending a shiver down his spine. He stepped back, his heart pounding. This wasn't a coincidence. It was an inexplicable, suffocating manifestation of his deepest fears. He had to find out what was happening before it consumed him and his patients. As he locked the door behind him, the clinic seemed to whisper in the dark, a malevolent presence lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next moment to strike. Warren couldn't shake the feeling that his nightmare was just beginning, the suffocating grip of fear tightening around him, relentless and malevolent. The city was a vibrant tapestry of life, the streets humming with activity. Yet, as Warren walked to his favorite cafe, he couldn't shake the pervasive dread that clung to him like a second skin. The sunlight felt colder, the sounds more distant, and every face in the crowd seemed to carry a shadow of something unrelenting. He took a deep breath, trying to ground himself, but the sensation of being watched, of an invisible force trailing his every step, was unshakable. He ordered his usual black coffee and sat by the window, watching the world go by. He opened his notebook, intending to jot down notes for his upcoming sessions, but his mind was elsewhere. The clinic's atmosphere had grown increasingly oppressive, the shadows darker and the whispers more pronounced. His thoughts kept drifting back to the water leak, to the suffocating fear he had experienced in his office. Lost in his thoughts, he barely noticed when the waitress set his coffee down. The world outside seemed to tilt for a moment, the buildings stretching impossibly high, their tops vanishing into a sky that seemed unnaturally close. A wave of vertigo hit him, and he gripped the table to steady himself. Suddenly, he was no longer in the cafe. He stood on the edge of a skyscraper, the ground miles below, the wind howling around him. Panic surged through him as the invisible force seemed to push him closer to the edge. His fear of heights, buried deep for years, roared to life with a vengeance. He closed his eyes, taking deep, shuddering breaths, trying to will the vision away. When he opened them, he was back in the cafe, the world returning to its normal proportions. He wiped the sweat from his brow, his hands trembling. The episodes were becoming more frequent, more intense. Whatever was haunting him was growing stronger. "Alex," a familiar voice called, breaking through his haze. Delaney Clark, his colleague and friend, slid into the seat across from him. Her presence was a welcome anchor in the storm of his mind. "Emily," he greeted, managing a weak smile. "What brings you here?" She studied him, her brow furrowed. "You look like you've seen a ghost. What's going on?" He hesitated, the words catching in his throat. How could he explain what was happening without sounding insane? But the urgency in her eyes compelled him to speak. He recounted the strange occurrences, the water, the shadows, the phobias manifesting in terrifyingly real ways. Emily listened, her expression growing more concerned with each word. "Alex, this sounds serious. Have you considered the possibility of a shared delusion among your patients? Or maybe something even more sinister?" "More sinister," he echoed, a chill running down his spine. "Yes," she replied, lowering her voice. "What if there's a connection to the clinic itself? You mentioned a previous therapist. What do you know about them?" Warren shook his head. "Not much. The files were sparse. Just that Gerald Stevenson was the therapist before me, and he left abruptly." "We need to find out more," Emily said firmly. "There could be something in his past that explains what's happening now." Their conversation was interrupted by the cafe door swinging open, a gust of wind sweeping through, carrying a whisper that seemed to speak directly to Alex. Unrelenting, stalking, pervasive dread. He shivered, pulling his coat tighter around him. "You're right. We need to dig deeper." Later that evening they met at the clinic. The building loomed ominously in the twilight, the windows dark and uninviting. Inside, the oppressive atmosphere was palpable, the shadows deep and flickering as they moved through the corridors. They found Dr. Stevenson's old office, a room that had been sealed off and forgotten. Dust covered every surface, and the air was thick with neglect. As they sifted through old files and journals, a picture began to emerge. Stevenson had been obsessed with fear, not just treating it but understanding its very essence, its power. "He conducted experiments," Emily said, reading from a journal. "He believed that by confronting phobias in a heightened state, one could break free of them. But something went wrong. His notes become erratic, mentioning an unseen entity feeding off the fear." Warren's heart pounded. What if that entity is still here? A loud crash echoed through the clinic, followed by a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Pervasive dread. Unrelenting. Stalking. Emily grabbed his arm. "We need to get out of here, Alex. Now." As they fled the clinic, the sense of being watched, of something invisible stalking them, grew stronger. They burst into the cool night air, but the feeling didn't leave them. It clung to them, an unrelenting reminder that whatever haunted the clinic was far from done with them. The drive back to Delaney Clark's apartment was a blur. The city's lights streaked by, but Warren could only think about the journal they had found. Stevenson's notes had confirmed his worst fears. Something malevolent lurked in the clinic, feeding on the phobias of its patients. The malevolent presence had grown stronger with each passing day, and it was now unrelenting, its influence spreading beyond the clinic's walls. "We need to be methodical about this," Emily said, breaking the tense silence as they entered her apartment. She locked the door behind them, glancing nervously at the shadows gathering in the corners of the room. "We can't let it know we're onto it." "Agreed," Alex replied, his voice steady despite the frantic beating of his heart. "But how do we fight something we can't see?" Emily pulled out a stack of files she'd brought from the clinic, spreading them across the table. "We start by understanding its patterns. Stevenson's experiments were based on heightened states of fear. If we can find a way to control that, maybe we can turn the tables. They worked late into the night, poring over patient records and Stevenson's fragmented notes. The air grew heavy with tension, every creak of the building, every rustle of papers, making them jump. Alex's mind kept drifting back to his patients, whose phobias had been escalating to dangerous levels. Sarah's spiders, Michael's drowning nightmares. It was as if the entity was amplifying their fears to feed on them more effectively. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the kitchen. Emily and Alex froze, exchanging frantic looks. "Stay here," Alex whispered, grabbing a kitchen knife before cautiously approaching the sound. The kitchen was empty, but a cabinet door swung open, banging against the frame. Alex's heart raced as he slowly approached, reaching out to close it. The moment his fingers touched the wood, an intense heat surged through him. He staggered back, dropping the knife, his mind filling with images of fire, flames consuming his home, his loved ones, everything he held dear. "Alex," Emily's voice cut through the hallucination, pulling him back. He was on the floor, drenched in sweat, the cabinet door still swinging innocuously. "This is getting worse," he panted, his voice trembling. "It's like it knows we're trying to stop it." Emily helped him to his feet, her face pale but determined. "We can't let it win. We need to find the source, something that ties it to the clinic." The next day they returned to the clinic, their resolve steeled against the creeping dread. The building loomed before them, a fortress of fear. Inside, the atmosphere was thicker, more oppressive, the shadows darker, and the air heavy with a sense of impending doom. They started in the basement, where Stevenson had conducted his most extreme experiments. The air was damp and cold, the walls lined with old medical equipment and forgotten files. As they dug through the clutter, the sense of being watched intensified. "Here," Emily said, pulling out a dusty box. Inside were tapes of Stevenson's sessions. They played one, the grainy video showing Stevenson in a session with a patient suffering from pyrophobia. As the patient described their fear, Stevenson's expression grew almost eager. "The entity thrives on fear," Stevenson's recorded voice crackled through the speaker. "To control it, one must confront it in its purest form. Only then can one hope to overcome." The session grew more intense, the patients screaming as Stevenson pushed them further, the lights flickering wildly in the room. Suddenly the screen went dark, replaced by a whispering voice. Frantic, terrifying, relentless. Alex turned off the tape, his hands shaking. He didn't just confront their fears, he invoked something that's still here. They were interrupted by a loud crash upstairs, followed by a patient's scream. Alex and Emily rushed up to find one of Alex's patients, Mark, thrashing in the hallway, his eyes wild with terror. "Fire," Mark screamed. "It's everywhere." Alex grabbed Mark's shoulders, trying to snap him out of the hallucination. "Mark, it's not real. Look at me." But Mark's fear was too overwhelming, and the entity fed on it, the temperature in the hallway rising, the walls seeming to shimmer with heat. Emily doused Mark with water from a nearby cooler, shocking him back to reality. Frantic, terrifying. Relentless, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if mocking their efforts. Emily looked at Alex, her eyes filled with determination. "We need to end this now. We confront it together, force it to reveal itself." They gathered the patients in the main therapy room, explaining the situation as best they could. The room was filled with a palpable sense of fear, but also a spark of hope. Alex and Emily led a group therapy session, encouraging each patient to face their phobias head-on, to take back control. The lights flickered, the air grew thick with tension, and the whispers turned into a cacophony of voices, but Alex and Emily held firm. They guided the patients through their fears, each success weakening the entity's hold. Frantic, terrifying. Relentless, the voices were now a deafening roar, but Alex felt the tide turning. As the patients confronted their deepest fears, the entity's power waned. Finally, with a final collective push, the oppressive presence shattered, the whispers fading into nothingness. The clinic fell silent, the air clearing as if a storm had passed. Exhausted but victorious, Alex and Emily looked at each other, knowing the battle was won, but the war was far from over. The entity was gone for now, but its memory lingered, a haunting reminder of the relentless power of fear. They had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, but the shadows would always be there, lurking at the edges, waiting for the next moment of weakness. The clinic was eerily silent as Dralex Warren and Dremely Clark walked through its corridors. The air was thick with tension, and the shadows seemed to writhe with a life of their own. They had weakened the entity, but it was far from defeated. Alex knew that to truly rid themselves of this nightmare, he would have to confront his deepest fear head-on. And that meant venturing into the underground tunnels where the clinic's foundations lay. "Are you sure about this, Alex?" Emily's voice was tinged with concern as they stood before the heavy door leading to the basement. "We don't know what we'll find down there." Alex nodded, determination etched on his face. "It's the only way. Stevenson's notes mentioned an old, unused tunnel system beneath the clinic. If the entity is tied to this place, we'll find the source down there." Emily hesitated, but then nodded, steeling herself. "All right, let's do this." They descended the narrow staircase, the air growing colder and more oppressive with each step. The walls were damp, and the flickering light from their flashlights cast long, ominous shadows. The tunnel stretched out before them, a dark, claustrophobic passage that seemed to close in tighter the further they went. Alex's breath quickened, his heart pounding in his chest. He had always feared enclosed spaces, a phobia that had haunted him since childhood. As a boy, he had been trapped in a collapsed building for hours, the darkness and crushing weight of the debris pressing down on him, leaving an indelible mark on his psyche. "Stay close," he whispered to Emily, his voice barely audible over the sound of dripping water echoing through the tunnel. They moved forward, the walls pressing in around them. The darkness was almost tangible, a suffocating blanket that seemed to sap the air from their lungs. Alex could feel the entity's presence, a malevolent force lurking just beyond the reach of their flashlights, watching, waiting. Suddenly, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber, the walls lined with ancient, crumbling brick. In the center of the room was a stone altar, covered in strange symbols and surrounded by burnt-out candles. The air was thick with the smell of decay and something else, something metallic and sharp. "This is it," Alex said, his voice trembling. "This is where Stevenson conducted his final experiments." Emily moved closer to the altar, her flashlight illuminating the symbols etched into the stone. These symbols, they're ancient, ritualistic. Stevenson wasn't just treating phobias. He was trying to harness them, to control the entity. As they examined the altar, the air grew colder, and the shadows deepened. The sense of dread was overwhelming, pressing down on them like a physical weight. Alex could hear whispers, faint and distorted, as if coming from a great distance. Claustrophobic, horrific, suffocating darkness. The words echoed in his mind, the entity's voice blending with his own fears. Suddenly the walls seemed to close in, the tunnel shrinking around them. Alex's breath caught in his throat, the familiar panic rising. The flashlight flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. "Emily," he shouted, reaching out blindly. He felt her hand grasp his, a lifeline in the suffocating blackness. "I'm here, Alex," she replied, her voice steady despite the fear. "We need to stay calm. Remember your training." Alex forced himself to breathe, to focus. The darkness was oppressive, but it wasn't real. It was the entity, feeding on his fear, trying to break him. He had to fight back. "Focus on your breathing," he told himself, his voice shaking. "In and out. Slow and steady." As he calmed his mind, the darkness seemed to recede slightly, the walls less suffocating. He could feel the entity's presence, a cold, malevolent force pressing in on him, but he refused to give in. "Emily, we need to disrupt the ritual," he said, his voice stronger. "If we can break its connection to this place, we can weaken it." Together, they worked to dismantle the altar, overturning the stone and scattering the symbols. The air grew colder, the whispers louder, but they pressed on. Alex's heart pounded, the darkness pressing in, but he focused on Emily's steady presence beside him. Claustrophobic, horrific. Suffocating darkness, the entity's voice was a roar now, a tidal wave of terror crashing over him. But then, as they overturned the last stone, a blinding light filled the chamber, the oppressive weight lifting. The entity let out a screech, a sound of pure rage and pain, before fading into nothingness. The light faded, leaving them in silence. The tunnel was still dark, but the suffocating fear was gone. Alex took a deep breath, the air sweet and clean. They had done it. They had broken the entity's hold. As they made their way back to the surface, Alex felt a sense of profound relief. The battle was won, but he knew the war was far from over. The entity might be gone, but the memory of its presence lingered, a haunting reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond the edges of perception. He and Emily emerged into the cool night air, the clinic behind them a silent sentinel. They had faced their deepest fears and survived, but the shadows would always be there, waiting for the next moment of weakness. But for now they had won, and that was enough. Dralek's Warren stood in the dawn light, the clinic looming behind him. It looked almost serene, its windows reflecting the rising sun. But he knew the truth. The entity's hold had been broken, but the memory of its suffocating darkness lingered in every shadow, every whisper of wind through the hallways. Inside, the clinic felt different. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, replaced by an eerie calm. The patients moved through their sessions with a cautious optimism, their phobias still present but no longer wielded by a malevolent force. Alex walked through the corridors, his steps echoing in the quiet. He paused at his office door, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. Emily was already there, sorting through the remnants of Stevenson's notes. She looked up as he entered, her eyes reflecting the same mix of relief and residual fear he felt. "We've come a long way," she said, her voice soft but steady. Alex nodded, sitting down opposite her. "We have. But I can't help feeling that this isn't over. The entity might be gone, but the scars it left behind, they're still here." Emily leaned back, her gaze thoughtful. "Scars can heal, Alex. It just takes time. And therapy, ironically enough." He managed a wry smile. "I guess it's time to take my own advice then, to confront and overcome." He reached for his notebook, opening it to a fresh page. The blank paper stared back at him, a canvas for the next chapter. He began to write, documenting everything they had discovered, every fear they had faced, and every method they had used to combat the entity. It was a therapy session of his own, a way to process and understand the trauma. Hours passed as they worked together, piecing together the story of the clinic and the dark force that had haunted it. The process was cathartic, the act of writing and speaking out loud bringing a sense of closure. As the sun climbed higher, casting warm light into the room, Alex looked up from his notes. "We should share this with the patients. They deserve to know what happened and how we beat it." Emily nodded. "It's part of the healing process. For all of us." They gathered the patients in the main therapy room, the place where they had made their final stand. The air was thick with anticipation, but also hope. Alex stood before them, his heart pounding, but he drew strength from Emily's presence beside him. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady. "We've been through a lot together, and I think it's time we talk about what happened. About the entity that haunted this place and how we overcame it." He spoke about Stevenson's experiments, the malevolent force that had fed on their fears, and the final confrontation in the underground tunnels. The patients listened in silence, their faces reflecting a mix of shock and relief. When he finished, there was a long moment of silence. Then Sarah, his first patient, stood up. "So it's over. The nightmares, the manifestations. They're gone." Alex nodded. "The entity is gone. But the memories of what we faced will remain. And that's why we're here. To help each other heal, to support one another as we move forward." Mark, the man who had feared fire, raised his hand. "What if it comes back?" Emily stepped forward. "We faced it once, and we beat it. We know its methods now, its weaknesses. If it ever comes back, we'll be ready, and we'll face it together." The room buzzed with a renewed sense of strength and solidarity. They had faced their deepest fears and emerged victorious. The scars were still there, but they were no longer debilitating. They were reminders of their resilience, their ability to confront and conquer the darkest of nightmares. After the meeting, Alex and Emily walked through the clinic one last time. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that felt less menacing, more like familiar companions. They reached the front door, pausing to look back. "We did it," Alex said, a note of pride in his voice. Emily smiled, a haunting reminder of the battles they had fought together. "Yes, we did, and we'll keep doing it, as long as we need to." They stepped outside, the evening air cool and refreshing. The clinic stood behind them, no longer a place of fear, but a sanctuary of healing. The entity was gone, but the fight against fear would continue. They were ready, and they were stronger for having faced the darkness. As they walked away, the whispers of the past faded, replaced by the comforting sounds of the city. The clinic, once a place of terror, was now a symbol of their triumph over the lingering shadows.